this presentation. I'll give you a little bit of background. In the BC, that's before COVID. We contracted with the Landmark Society of West New York to do what we call a reconnaissance level survey, or a historic sources survey of both the village and the town. It was both the village and the town contracted with them. And the final step of that survey is this presentation to show you what was found and how it was done, and also to talk to you a little bit about what it might be used for. That would be nominations to the National Register. And then I believe that there will be a question and answer session afterwards. And so it's my extreme pleasure to introduce to you Klem, who is a preservation planner with the Landmark Society of West New York. Can we have a round of applause?
Well, welcome everyone, and please stay with me. I'm going to have to manually do my slides because the clicker is not working that I brought along. But welcome and thank you for coming. This is actually a really great turnout, and I'm really excited to share with you our the outcome of the survey that we did in the town and village. I will, full disclosure, ahead of time, my former colleague actually did the bulk of the survey. You may have seen, if you saw us out and about taking photos, you may have seen me with him because I did help with that portion. But Ryan Jarls actually did the survey itself. This was his project that he took lead on. He fortunately and unfortunately is now down in historic Savannah, Georgia, and so here I am to present the outcome of the survey. So hopefully I do it justice. All right, so to start out a little bit just about the Landmark Society and who we are and what we do and why we'll be doing this. We are a nonprofit organization, regional. We work in a 9-county region. You can see on the screen, I know it's a little small, I'm sorry. All the counties that we work in. And we are membership based, and we're actually one of the oldest preservation organizations in the country, founded in 1937 by a group of women who wanted to save some buildings in the Rochester area. And so here we are today. What do we do? We actually own some historic sites around the Rochester area, so we take care of those. We host public events. We do public outreach and education opportunities. My colleagues does educational things with school groups. We do advocacy for preservation. The statewide historic preservation conference, which is coming up in April. My colleague actually plans that, so we kind of run that. We provide advice to homeowners and property owners, commercial owners, if you're looking to do work to your property and aren't sure what to do and want to do something historically appropriate, you can contact us and we can kind of give you some advice on how to go about that. We also support local communities, and we assist, like I said, property owners, developers. We work with local governments, neighborhoods, community leaders, so a lot of different things that we do, as well as things like National Register nominations and historic resource surveys like this. So I want to go over a little bit about historic preservation organizations and agencies that are involved in all of these types of projects. Sometimes it can get a little confusing about who is who. So we have both the government side and then the private nonprofit side of things. On the local level, your government side is obviously your village or the town here in Nunda. On the local side of the private nonprofit sector, you have us, the Landmark Society of Western New York. At the state level, that's where you get the New York State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, S-H-P-O. They're the ones that review, so when Brian completed this survey, it was submitted to SHPO, and they review it, and they kind of give us their opinion on what they think. And you'll see what I'm talking about later when we go through recommendations that came out of this survey. They also review National Register nominations, so we'll hear a little bit about that later as well. On the nonprofit side at the state level, you have the Preservation League of New York State. They're somewhat like us at Landmark Society, except they're a statewide organization, and they have a host of grant programs. They do most of the advocacy work across the state, and they do a lot of really great work. Then on a national level, you have the National Park Service. You'll hear a little more about them later when I go quickly through what a National Register nomination is. But basically, they're the federal side of reviews when it comes to projects that involve that. And then on the nonprofit side at the national level, you have the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So that's kind of who we are. All right, so now just start talking about the project itself. So, as Nunda said, the village and town of Nunda contracted with the Landmark Society back in, I think it was in 2020, that's when we started the project. So in July of 2020, we contracted with the village and town to do this historic resources survey. The study area included the municipal boundaries of the village and the town. And then the purpose of the survey is to locate and document historic resources throughout the village and town, and determine eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places is one of the pieces of this. Either finding historic districts or properties that are individually eligible for the National Register. However, the other side of this is that the survey can be used as a tool for the town and the village, as a planning tool, as a tourism tool, and it's just as pride for the community to understand the history. And often people live in these older homes or own older buildings, and not everybody, but they don't always see the value in having a historic building. So sometimes these historic resource surveys are nice in that way too, because it shows that someone besides you also cares about your property. So in the summer of 2021 is when we did our field work. It started out with a windshield, what we call a windshield survey. It's where we drive every street of the town and village, every street. And we have maps with us, and we kind of mark our initial thoughts of of different properties, what we think may be eligible. And this is on kind of a quick drive-by. Then we come back and we did feet on the ground survey work. So if you saw us out photographing, we took pictures of every house in the village, and most of them within the town as well. And what we did with those is we created, it's called Trucker through the State Historic Preservation Office. It's their survey system. So we created individual survey forms for each of these properties, which will then be forever in the state's cultural resource information system. And it's basically a page that talks about a quick description of the building, a quick why it's significant, with a couple of photographs. Then in the summer and fall of 2021, we did some, well, but mainly Ryan, did some research. He worked a lot with Joan and used the Historical Society archives, which he said were outstanding. He also did use some online archives and then historic maps, such as sandboard maps and other historic maps that you can find that help show the changes that happened one day and when things were developed. And that also helps us kind of determine, how long has the property been around, what changes have been made, that sort of thing. Then in the fall of 2021 is when the survey report was completed. The identification of district boundaries was made, so you'll see in a few minutes I'll go through the recommendations that came out of this and what these districts are. There was a historic context statement created. Basically what we do is when we find something that we think would be a historic district, which is a grouping of buildings together that could be listed in the National Register, they typically have a similar context. So that would be, architectural integrity, or, for example, you'll see later with the Nunda, the village of Nunda historic district that we're proposing, that this area, the boundary, had similar historic context related to transportation, commerce, architecture, things like that. And so that's kind of what helps guide us in determining, are there grouping of buildings together that are significant, or are there individual properties that are significant? And then the draft report was done, and that's a summary of the research and field work, and then the recommendations for National Register listing, as well as general recommendations for for using Nunda's historic architecture as a resource for planning and development. So this slide here is just an overview. I have slides for each of these where I'll give a little more detail for the recommendations. So out of this survey, we found that there is what we believe is an eligible historic district, and that would be the Nunda Village Historic District. Also a potential historic district out in Dalton, and then 3 individual properties that we believe are individually eligible for the National Register. And you can see Where the purple is up here, this would be the Nunda district showing the boundaries of the village. This is Dalton, and then the 3 stars are showing those individual properties that we found. Okay, so to start, and remember this one because we'll come back to it later, the first recommendation is the proposed Nunda Village Historic District. This encompasses the majority of what the village is, or the village core, so it has both commercial and residential properties in it. There's approximately 350 properties total within this boundary that we have identified, and it was done as the village of Nunda was a dynamic rural crossroads with transportation, commerce, all sorts of things, which makes it significant, not just the houses and the buildings that are here, but also because of the history that happened here. So it was a densely packed commercial corridor historically, and it was developed through mill manufacturing and the canal and railroad boom that happened here. And that was in the early 19th century into the 20th century. And then a relatively rapid residential development at the turn of the century. So that's when a lot of the residential properties within the village here were constructed. And then continued commercial and residential expansion into the early 20th century as well. The period of significance that came out of this would be approximately, and again, these are just recommendations coming out, so these are not final, it's not a final boundary, it's not final period of significance, but a period of significance is what we use when writing a National Register nomination, which tells us the time period that we're listing the district for. So in this case right now, out of the survey, we are looking at the 1810s, which is when the first homes were constructed in the central portion of town, until about 1955, when the Foot Company was consolidated. And that sort of resulted in where we started to see a decline in residential housing construction. So the village of Nunda Historic District, remember this one? Because I'm going to come back and talk about it later. We also had a potential eligible district, which would be the Dalton Historic District. And you can see in the bluey green color here, kind of the area that we were looking at. This is something that, as the Landmark Society, when we came out and surveyed, we felt like there may be something there, but in order to really make that judgment, it would require more than the reconnaissance level survey that was done. So reconnaissance level survey is a very surface level nomination. It doesn't get, or surface level survey, it doesn't get into in-depth information on specific properties. In this case, we thought that there was, decent intact homes architecturally there. There were some, commercial buildings there that were, so we felt like there may be something there, but it's something that would need further study in order to really say that it's eligible. So in Dalton, we found approximately 100 properties in this boundary that may be eligible together as a district. And it was a small outcropping of residential housing built from a once bustling commercial district and a railway stop that was there. So Dalton was pretty significant. Its main business district was mostly destroyed by fire in 1943, so much of that is gone now. And then remnants of the booming era of Dalton's past still exist in the form of a large mill and railroad building, and then also large elegant homes. There are some pretty great homes down there. And they were constructed along Fair, Main, and State Street for the most part. And the extent structures within the hamlet and they're associated with the town's growth, and they hold potential for a possible Dalton Historic District. So the reason we're calling it potential and not proposed is because it does need some further study to know. However, when SHPO reviewed this survey report that was submitted to them, they did tell us that they do not believe that Dalton is an eligible district. I would beg to differ with them. SHPO is kind of the final decider here in the state of New York, but with further information, if somebody in the potential Dalton Historic District wanted to take it further, there could be a more in-depth survey completed to try and show SHPO why what's there now is eligible for listing, and that would have to be that there are enough buildings left to kind of tell that story of the history, So I think part of the problem they had was that 1943 fire took out a lot of the commercial center of that area. But like I said, we never take their no off of the survey as an end-all be-all. All right, and then the first of our individually eligible properties, we found Union Cemetery, which is on Birdsall Road. This is the second largest cemetery and one of the oldest in Nunda, and it was established sometime before 1840. And if you're wondering about cemeteries, the one here in the village is within the village historic district boundary, so it would be listed with that. The burial grounds for many people who settled in this, near the southern edge of Nunda as well as nearby Grove. And it was the present name, so Union Cemetery, was used by the 1890s but became official when the Union Cemetery Association organized in 1906. So that's when that became the official name of the cemetery. And it has been maintained by the town of Nunda since 2011. So the interesting thing about National Register nomination is it's not just about buildings. It can be about landscapes, it can be about cemeteries, it can be railroad buildings, it can be objects, it can be a whole list of things. All right, another individually eligible in the town, and we have the homeowner here, is 1939 Payne Road. This is an intact farmstead, is how we looked at that. It has the Greek Revival style house, and it remains, it still has most of its historic materials and features intact. But it also has is architecturally significant house, but also because it retains most of the outbuildings that were associated with the agricultural use of this property. And so in that case, we think that this is an eligible individual property, which if the property owner decided to move forward with the nomination, it would list the house and all of the outbuildings and the land that goes with it that's associated with that farm complex. So that is this one here. Yeah. And actually, she's got a great photo of it from what year did you say it was?
1860.
1860s with her, if you want to look at that.
Yep.
And then the final individual property that we believe is eligible is 2146 State Route 436, which we found the name of Gelton Farm for it, but there were a few others. So if that is not the correct name, we're trying to associate this farm with the property name. So this, it again has intact outbuildings. I wouldn't quite look at it as a farmstead necessarily, but it does retain its Italian style house, and that's also architecturally intact along with these really great outbuildings. And so we thought this property is also individually eligible for the National Register. So that first part of this presentation is to give you the results of the survey project. I'm going to be switching now into kind of what the next steps are. So we're talking about the National Register of Historic Places. Before I move on, does anyone have questions about the survey? Yes.
Are those the only two individual houses eligible throughout the whole village?
Yeah, so in order to be individually eligible for the National Register, a property has to be mainly intact, both on the interior and exterior. But if you're looking at it, it's usually going to be a complex. If it's an individual home, it has to be pretty intact on the interior as well. So we did find, and again, this was just kind of surface level reconnaissance level survey. We did find a few other properties out in the town that we thought were really great architecturally, the house, except their farm complex was no longer standing, or that it had been sold off and there were some other buildings on it that wouldn't be historic. We also found a few places with some really great outbuildings, but it was missing the farmhouse. And in those cases, the SHPO will not list those properties without the main farmhouse with it, generally, unless there's something really, really significant and historically important that happened there or someone who lived there, but generally you do need the main house with that property. But if you own a property that is not in the village district boundary and wasn't one of the two properties that we said was individually eligible, you can get in touch with me because sometimes things are missed. And if you want us to take another look at your property, we could certainly do that.
There were a number of other residents in the buildings in the town that would be considered eligible at the time the original draft came out. What happened to those?
That is a great question because I know that in the report, these are the 3 that were in there. I can certainly look into that and find out what happened. I know that there was some back and forth with SHPO that Brian went through, and there were a few properties that they said no to that we were on the fence about. We thought we could make the argument for them, and we shared what we knew about them, and SHPO said no, so it could be that they struck those out.
Of course, they could all apply anyway. It's not
Absolutely, yes. Yes, if you have a property that's not included as potentially eligible in this survey, that doesn't mean that you can't, contact the state and see if you could be eligible. You can always submit, it's called a determination of eligibility. Basically, they're just going to ask for some history and why you think the property is individually significant, and they'll consider that. We did also include in this survey some inventory forms for other properties out in the town. So they are surveyed in the state system. They just weren't determined individually eligible for listing in the National Register.
Within the village, there are individual properties that are eligible. This church is eligible, in the village building, the brick building on the corner. But when I started to go forward with nomination for the church building and the village building for the National Register, I was told, well, no, you should wait because they'll be included in the district nomination.
Yes.
And so, if that is what your question was about, the individual buildings within the village,
Yes.
I think rather than the town.
Okay, that makes sense. So yes, there are some properties within the village itself that would be individually eligible for the National Register. However, how the state kind of does things is if your building is individually eligible, but it's also within a larger historic district, they want the district listed and not the individual property. And basically then you wouldn't need an individual listing for your property because it doesn't change anything. It doesn't get you more recognition. It doesn't get you more financial incentive programs that you'd be eligible for. And so generally what the SHPO office does, just as you had said, with the village building, with this church, because this survey was done and there's an eligible historic district that they're a part of, the state wants them listed as the historic district as part of that and not individually. It's just something the state does. You can always still list it individually, but generally they're going to want the district to be listed. And the reason for that is then it gets more buildings listed, more people eligible for tax credits, which we'll talk about later.
Does every building within those boundaries of the village district that is considered eligible? Every structure on every street that falls within that map?
So that's that's sort of part of the next steps.
Okay.
Generally, I would say the majority of the properties within that district boundary, and let me go back to that while we're talking about it. The majority of properties within this purple boundary here are going to be considered, when you do the actual National Register listing, there's contributing properties and then non-contributing properties. The majority of the buildings within this boundary would be considered contributing. There may be some that are considered non-contributing, and that's generally because they're not at least 50 years old. They've been so significantly altered that they don't appear as their historic building did. Now, to be contributing, you don't have to be in pristine condition from the day it was constructed. There can be changes, but sometimes it's more about the facade of the building. So if the windows have changed, windows have changed sizes, or someone's put in a whole grouping of windows where there never had been, and that appearance of the building isn't quite, you can't really see the historic appearance, that may be a reason for it to be non-contributing. So with this, each of the individual survey forms that we did for all of these properties, does have them put in as either contributing and non-contributing to the district, but the final decision on that will be made when the National Register nomination is completed.
What are the street boundaries?
So the street boundaries here are, it goes past, I'm trying to remember which street this is up here. It's basically the whole village core. So it goes down to Mill Street and comes, right, that's Mill Street that runs right through here. Okay, so it's Mill Street, it includes the school and comes out just past it. There's an agricultural, there's like a farm building with some agricultural land. All of that's included because we have to go by the property boundary lines, so that gets included as well. There were a few houses down, it's state, right?
State.
Down State. So if you come down the State and come past the factory here, there's a grouping of houses that are included on this side of the street as well as a few over here. The properties on this side were left out because they were either no longer intact or they were newly constructed.
I thought when we made the case to have the west side of State Street in the historic district, even though they were not contributing buildings in the section where the old factory used to be, where the casket factory used to be. But it looks like what they've done is they picked out only the one house, and then they've left the other outside. What happens when those are, like, if those buildings now are torn down sometime and new houses are built or whatever, then those would all have to be considered individually for, they're not going to be potentially in a district.
So this was one thing that was surprising to us. I remember when I was doing this, is originally we weren't sure that these properties down here could be connected to the district. And the reason for that is that the state and the National Park Service doesn't allow for what we call kind of gerrymandering the boundary lines. And so we thought because it gets very tight here and there was properties that we weren't so sure about, that they wouldn't let us include this. However, after talking to the reviewer at SHPA, Virginia wanted those included. So we were a little surprised by that. I think if something were to happen here and new houses were built in that area, it wouldn't impact this because they've already cut out those buildings, so it wouldn't be considered.
Essentially, the last section was going to be dropped out completely until we made the case.
Right.
That it really needed to be included.
Correct, right. Yeah, so if new houses or new buildings or something were put, in these parts that were cut out, it won't impact that. They will stay part of the district.
If there's new construction in a place in the district, be it a contributing building that gets torn down, does that affect the district boundaries or anything like that?
It doesn't. So basically what would happen is that would just be considered a non-contributing property. There are instances like if for some reason everybody in the village of Nunda decided to knock their house down and build new, that could potentially make it so the historic district would be pulled off the National Register. That's not going to happen, and generally the state doesn't police these things anyways. So the reality is no, that won't impact anything. And also being listed in the National Register, which we'll talk about later, doesn't place any protections on the property, so things like demolition could unfortunately happen still. And again, the district boundary you're seeing here is based off of the reconnaissance level survey. So next steps is National Register, and that's when we really get into looking at the boundary lines, making sure that they're all correct, that we've included everything that needs to be in. So the boundary lines you see here could expand, they could get a little smaller, but these are the ones that came out of the survey that we think should be in the district. We've certainly had instances in the past where additional properties were included in after we took another look. When we start a National Register nomination project, typically someone from the State Historic Preservation Office will come out with us and we drive them around where we're looking, and they kind of help determine what they will allow to be the final boundaries. So again, while this is pretty much what you might see in the National Register nomination, this is not the end-all be-all final district boundary that's determined during the National Register nomination process. Any other questions on this? No? Okay, so I'm going to move on now to what next steps are. And that is the National Register of Historic Places nomination. So now that we've completed the survey, we're now working with the village to move forward with that Nunda Village Historic District. So we'll be talking about that over the next few days and looking at a grant to help with it, which is the same grant that helped pay for the survey to be completed. So I'm going to just quickly run through what this National Register what the National Register is, what those benefits are to those property owners, and then we'll talk about the tax credit program that you would become eligible for if you're within this district or an individual property listed on the National Register. So the National Register of Historic Places, it was established by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It's the official list of historic buildings, sites, structures, and objects recognized as significant in American history. It can also be related to architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. So, for example, we just did a nomination for a building on the University of Rochester's campus, and it's being listed not for its architecture, which is actually amazing. It's being listed for its history with LGBTQ plus history that really started all of that in Rochester. So it can be intangible things that you can be eligible for as well. Resources can be listed individually or as contributing to a historic district. So that's kind of what we just talked about. We're not going to be looking at a historic district, but there are those two other properties we found that are individually eligible that are out in the town, so they're not included in the district boundaries. One of the most important things to know about the National Register, that a listing is honorary. It's an honorary designation, so it doesn't come with any restrictions from the state or the federal government. The only time that you would have a restriction on what you do with your property by either one of them is if you're using state or federal funding for a project at that property. If you're a residential property owner, that's probably not going to happen. And if you're a commercial property owner, I guess you could get state or federal funding for something you do. But for the most part, unless you are accepting money from the state or federal government, this is just an honorary designation. There are no restrictions placed on your property. If you want to paint it bright pink, you do that. If you want to tear a building down, then go to the village or the town, you can do that. So again, honorary designation, it does not have any restrictions on you as a property owner. It also doesn't place any protection on your property. So again, honorary designation. So what is a historic district? So remember now we're talking about the village of Nunda's potential or proposed historic district. So the historic district is a grouping of properties such as a residential neighborhood or a village like here in Nunda. It can be commercial downtowns, and it can be industrial complexes with multiple buildings. District boundaries are determined by several factors. Some of them I kind of mentioned earlier. But it's usually based on the history and development of the neighborhood, town, or village, and also on the historic integrity of buildings within the proposed boundaries. So those are the two typical things that help you determine a district boundary. And then properties within the district are classified as either contributing or non-contributing. So that's what I was talking about before with the survey. Again, most of the properties within that boundary are going to be contributing. However, there will be a few that are non-contributing. Trying to think off the top of my head what might be, and I can't think of anything right now. I think up in the northern part of the district there may have been a newer constructed home, and I know that one I think was going to be non-contributing, just because it's not 50 years old. But again, contributing and non-contributing are our classifications. So the district nomination process, and this is kind of where we are with the village. So you would contract with the town or the village, municipality you're working with. And then we do similar for what we did with the survey project. We do research and field work. So again, we'll come out and we'll be taking some streetscape photos. Unlike the survey where we took photos of every single property here in the village, we would just be doing streetscapes. So we don't get individual property photos. Maybe something significant like the church or the village building that are individually eligible to kind of help show those off. But, so you will see us back out here again taking photos. We also have to do research because where the survey was a reconnaissance level survey, so it's very top level, not a deep dive into the history as much. This becomes something that we do very much so in-depth research. So we'll be coming back down into the Historical Society information, going much further than the survey did itself. And I don't know if you have a copy of the survey that people here in the village can see if they want to, but I can always send a digital copy of that survey if people want to see it. But again, you would see in that there is some historic context in there, a few pages of it. A National Register nomination, I think the survey itself, the historic context, was probably about 6 pages long. A National Register nomination for a district of this size would be anywhere from, I would guess, 60 to 150 pages long. So that's that gives you a better idea of how in-depth we go with research on this. Then we do a draft nomination that gets sent to the village for review and to the SHPO for their review. And they come back and they can give us feedback and comments. Sometimes they ask for edits. And we do that, and then the final National Register nomination is sent back to the state. From there, they put the National Register nomination forward to the State Review Board. And then when that's voted on, it gets listed in the State Register of Historic Places. So there's 2 registers. There's the State Register and the National Register. So by the time the nomination is completed, the village district would be in both. Usually, and I have never had an instance where I didn't see this happen, but I suppose it could. Personally, in my 12 years of doing this, I've never had a nomination get to the State Review Board and they deny it because you've been working with the SHPO reviewer, and if they don't think it'll move forward, you stop the project. However, that's why you do a survey like we already did, so they've already said yes to this district. So once the State Review Board approves this and it gets listed on the State Register of Historic Places, it is then forwarded on to the National Park Service. So remember, they are the government side at the national level. And they are the ones that administer the National Register of Historic Places that we just talked about a few slides ago. And once they approve this, and again, generally if the state approved it, it'll get approved at the National Register level as well. And then from there, property owners become eligible for the historic tax credit programs. And this is the part everyone loves. Okay, so benefits. Wondering why bother listing this, right? As I mentioned, it's an honorary designation, but it's a good designation to have. It promotes heritage tourism and economic development. It's something that the village can use as a planning tool. It raises awareness and pride in the community, in the community's past and its history. I've had a number of communities we've worked in where we do a final presentation and someone says, I've lived in this really old house my whole life, and I just thought it was an old house. And now I realize it's actually significant, and it is. You also become eligible for the historic tax credit programs, and we'll go over those in a moment. And then there's also, it opens the door for other historic preservation grant programs and loan programs. However, those are generally for nonprofit organizations, private foundations, and municipalities. Usually, most grant programs are not for individual homeowners, but you're still eligible for tax credit programs. So you're probably wondering what the historic tax credits are, and this is what most property owners like. So the historic tax credit program, there is the state historic tax credit program, and there's also the federal historic tax credit program. So the state program is administered by the State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO. Again, they review everything. They review the surveys, they review the nominations, they review the tax credits. The state has both a homeowner and a commercial tax credit program. So the federal historic tax credits are administered by the National Park Service, NPS, through your SHPO office. So actually SHPO reviews these first as well. So again, the National Park Service, they review National Register nominations and tax credit applications. However, the federal program is for commercial properties only. I know. All right, so to run through what these programs are, so you can kind of understand what you as a property owner may be getting into and eligible for with the National Register nomination. The tax credit is equal to 20% of your qualified rehabilitation expenses. It's a 20% income tax credit on your income taxes. You claim the credit when you file your New York State income taxes. Year that you're Part 3, and we'll talk about this in a moment, the year that you're Part 3, which shows the completed work, is signed and approved by a SHPO office. So, for example, let's say we get this nomination done, and in 2024 you become eligible for tax credits. If you do work, you can submit for the tax credit and claim that tax credit in 2024 if that's when it's approved. And your work that you're going to do towards the tax credit does have to be reviewed by a SHPO office before you do the work for it to be eligible, so just remember that. There are instances based on emergency things that have to be done where they could look back maybe a couple of weeks and allow that. On the screen here, I do have the State Historic Preservation contact information for the homeowner reviewer at SHPO. If you would like that, you don't have to take a picture or write it down or anything. You can always contact me. I'll give you her name as well. She is really great to work with. I know most people don't want to work with someone from the state, but I'm telling you that the SHPO reviewer is amazing. How to qualify. So you have to be a contributing structure to a historic district or be individually listed in the National Register. So you do have to have that designation. You have to be in a qualifying census tract, which Monday is. It has to be an owner-occupied structure. So if you rent out in total the entire residential property, it's not eligible for this program, but it may be eligible for the commercial. You have to do at least $5,000 worth of work. That can be across multiple projects or one project. And then 5% of your total project cost does have to be for exterior work, so that's something to remember. There is a 2-year recapture period, so basically if you use the tax credit program, the state gives you that 20% off your income taxes, or 20% towards your income taxes. If you were to say the following year, go and, rip out the front of your house and put a whole new facade, and the state finds out about that, they can recapture a portion of your tax credit, generally not the whole thing. But I'm assuming that if you use the tax credit program, you're probably not doing something like that to your home anyways. And then, like I said, the work does have to be approved by SHPO before it begins for it to be eligible. Let's see. Okay, so are there any commercial property owners here? Okay, since there's not, I'm just going to kind of skip over that. It really works the same way as the homeowner, but it's for commercial properties. And then commercial is also the one that can utilize the federal tax credit program. And we'll skip over that one since we don't have commercial property. So, qualified rehabilitation expenses. These are things that you can claim towards this tax credit. Things like painting, interior, exterior painting, stucco repair, plaster repair. You could do roof replacement or roof repair. Your floors, if you need a new kitchen, you can get a tax credit for that. If you need a new bathroom, you can get a tax credit for that. Your systems, such as HVAC, plumbing, electric, all eligible for the tax credit. So if you need to do upgrades to your home, you can do this with the tax credit program. Basically, what I like to tell people is anything within the building footprint. So if you were to pick up your house, turn it upside down and shake it, anything that falls out is probably not eligible. So that's furniture and things like that. But the structure itself. So it's a lot of things that are eligible for that. Your unqualified expenses, so these are things that you can't claim towards the tax credit. And that's acquisition costs. You can't claim credit on the purchase of a property. Detached garages or outbuildings. Unfortunately, the state of New York doesn't allow that. I was formerly a tax credit reviewer in the state of Maryland, and we did, and I really hope someday that New York changes the policy because your detached garages should be eligible. But unfortunately, they are not. If you have an attached garage, it is eligible, work that you do to that. Additions and new construction are not eligible. That doesn't mean that you can't do it. So a lot of people think that if they use a tax credit program, they won't be allowed to put an addition on their home. That's not true. You can. It just needs to be compatible with your historic house. And so the state would want to see that and review it, but you absolutely can put an addition on your own. Driveways, landscaping, fencing, that sort of thing. And then things like appliances for your kitchen or, washer, dryer are not eligible. Tools, so saws and those sort of things to do work are not eligible. And then your owner labor. So you can do the work yourself and claim the material costs, you just can't claim your own labor. However, if you have a contractor do their labor is eligible. And another important thing is if you're using the tax credit program or applying for any type of preservation funding, the review of the work is going to need to follow Secretary of the Interior standards. Basically, this is a guideline set by the National Park Service. It's used to review state and federally funded projects. And there's 4 key points to these 10 guidelines. Basically, the first is that buildings are used for their historic purpose or for a new purpose that doesn't significantly change the appearance of the building. That you retain historic materials and features, and that you repair them, but where deterioration is beyond repair, you replace either in kind or with material that retains that same historic appearance. They've been a little bit more open to like composite materials and things like that. The reason for that is old growth wood is no longer around, so pressure treated wood, they allow those sort of things. And then the final is that alterations or additions can't destroy the building. So basically, they wouldn't want you to rip off the entire side of your house to add an addition. But to do a small connection would be okay. And then historic materials have to be compatible. So it doesn't have to be built with the same brick or the same wood clad siding that your house may have, but it needs to be compatible materials. And I should also mention, all of this in the tax credit review and complying with Secretary's standards doesn't apply if you don't want to use the tax credit program. So again, honorary designation makes you eligible to use this tax credit program, but you don't have to. And in that case, nobody's reviewing nobody at the state or federal level is going to be reviewing what you do on your property. I'm assuming you need permits slowly. Okay, so next steps now that we've completed this survey, and as I mentioned, we're in talks now with the village to start the National Register nomination. So we're now working with the village. We're going to decide if they're going to be applying for the grant that will pay for this district nomination. It is the Preserve New York grant application, so I'll be talking with you about that. And then if they decide to contract with us again to continue on this journey, we would begin research and field work, probably in the fall, which is after the grant awards are announced. Then again, like I said, the draft nomination and the edited nomination would then be reviewed by SHPO, along to the State Review Board, be approved. The district would then be listed in the State Register of Historic Places. Then it will get moved on to the National Park Service for final listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And then property owners become eligible for the Historic Tax Credit Program. And the nice thing to note about the historic tax credits, if and when we start moving forward with the nomination, is as soon as we submit that draft nomination to SHPO, not the edited, but the draft nomination to SHPO, property owners can start submitting tax credit applications. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information I just threw at you. If you've got questions still about the survey, the National Register nomination, the tax credits, I'm happy to take those.
In the tax credits, you said is only the home eligible? What about outbuildings like a carriage house or something like that?
No, so unfortunately it would just be the main house that's eligible. We're really hoping, and there's a lot of advocacy coming from the Preservation League, who are our statewide nonprofit colleagues. There's a lot of pressure in the state to try and change that so that outbuildings would become eligible, but we're not.
So that means my barns aren't eligible.
Unfortunately, but actually, now you mentioned barns and you said carriage house. There's another tax credit program that New York State just kind of brought back, but it's better than the program used to be, and it's a historic barns tax credit. The great thing about that is your barn does not need to be listed on the National Register to be eligible. It just has to have been constructed prior to 1945. The really neat thing about this historic barns tax credit is that it's not just for barns, even though that's what it's called. They will do things like carriage houses and other outbuildings. Probably not a detached garage unless it had basically if it had an agricultural purpose, and they include a carriage house as having that, because carriage houses usually have horses in them. So pretty much everything besides maybe a detached automobile garage is likely going to be eligible in that program. Yeah, it's pretty great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is there any money available for municipalities, like our government buildings?
So generally tax credits aren't available to municipalities only because usually they don't pay income taxes. So usually no, but municipal buildings are eligible for other grant programs that like homeowners aren't eligible for. So for example, the Village of Nunda, the Village building, just received the Genesee Valley Revitalization Grant, which is actually a grant program that I'm running on behalf of the state. And so they're eligible for programs like that. So I think you guys got, you got 50,000 I think? Something like that, yeah. So there are other grant programs that municipal buildings and nonprofit buildings can apply for.
What would the American Legion be considered? That's the building up here in the corner.
That's a great question, and probably one that I would have to ask the show reviewer.
Because it's intact, it's never been touched, and I assume it's in the historic section.
So that's the building right on State Street, right there. So that is going to be listed as part of the historic district. I think that building is already individually listed too, though, isn't it?
I didn't follow the question.
The American Legion building here in Nunda,
The Carter Building.
the Carter building. I think
Is it individually listed?
Oh,
it is.
it just has to wait until the district comes through.
Yeah, I noticed that. I'm pretty sure there's one building here that's listed, and I thought that was it, maybe not. But it will be listed as part of the historic district, and it will be contributing.
The Union Block is
The
The
Union
Union
Block.
Block, okay, yeah, and that's, okay, yes, that's what I was thinking of. But yes, that building will be contributing to the Nunda Village Historic District. There's also other ways, and because I'm not a tax accountant or tax attorney, I really can't tell you much about this, but there are ways to syndicate a commercial tax credit, and so sometimes nonprofits and other organizations that don't pay income taxes are able to still use the tax credit program by syndicating or selling the tax credit to an entity that does pay taxes. I don't fully understand how that works, but if it's something you want to know more about, I can certainly get you in touch with the SHPO, with the correct SHPO staff person too.
Are you saying any contributing house within the district is eligible for tax credits, or they still have to be approved at some level?
Yeah, so once the nomination is done, any property within that boundary that is considered contributing is eligible for the tax credit program. You also have to meet those other eligibility requirements. So for example, if it's a residential property, it doesn't need to be the owner-occupied property. It can also be you as the owner lives there, but you rent out a portion, and then the tax credits are just a portion of the tax credits you're eligible for. So, well, I wouldn't say portion. You still get 20% of your costs, but you have to break it down by, there's this whole thing where you figure out the percentage of what is actually the homeowner space versus the renter space. And
Does that include modular homes or just stick built?
it includes anything that would be contributing. So it can be wood frame, it can be brick, it can be, basically whatever's in buildings. So modular homes could be, I would say, if you're thinking kind of like a trailer or something like that, generally it's probably not 50 years old, so it probably won't be in the historic district or contributing. But if there's a modular home that is 50 years old in the historic district, then it's
50 years old.
okay.
52.
Yes.
So next year.
You said next year it'll be 50?
Now.
Next year it'll be 50. It'll probably be included in the district. Because by the time this is actually listed, it would be 50 years old.
So you can age into.
Yes. Yes, so they do have a strict cutoff. So for example, when the nomination goes forward to be listed, if your house is at 49 years, they're not going to let us include it. But if it hit 50 years before that final designation happens, then we would put it in as contributing.
Take your time.
So if a house was built, like say in 1890, but it's been sided, is that, contributing?
Do you mean like if it was wood sided before and now it's vinyl sided?
What is behind it?
Yes, so generally, yes, those are still considered contributing. So how that would be determined is we kind of put together a methodology that we go through and say, okay, if it was wood-sided but it's now vinyl-sided, that's really the main thing that's changed about it, it's still contributing. If a property has, it has its vinyl-sided, vinyl windows, a porch that was never there has been put on, it's a more modern porch, and let's say, I don't know, an addition off the front of the home that changes the character, then that one may be non-contributing. That's when an actual historic building could be considered non-contributing. But generally, vinyl siding is not going to. Back when I first started doing nominations, vinyl siding did mean non-contributing, but they have really broadened what they accept now. However, if you're doing a tax credit project and you don't already have vinyl siding, you have wood siding, they will not give you a tax credit to put on vinyl siding.
Is it, so again?
If you have wood siding now and you apply for tax credits, it would have to go back as wood siding and repair. They would not do tax credits to change it to vinyl siding. But if it's already vinyl sided, then that's okay. So like I said, when we look at contributing buildings, it really doesn't have to be something that's pristine just as it was in 1890 or 1920. It can have some alteration to it. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I do have some cards up here if anyone wants one. If you come up with questions later, or want to know more about your property or own a property that we may have missed in the survey, please get in touch with me because we want to either make sure that does get included if it should have been, or that we get you information about the survey, the National Register Nomination and Tax Credits.
Could you put it back to the map so we could just look at it up close?
Yes. I know, it is hard to see.
I believe that we do have a copy of the,
Oh, stop.
both of the town and the village, that people can stop in and look at. And if you send me a digital copy, then I'll get it to people who like it.
I thought everybody would get up and start leaving.
Come on, let's go.
Thank you very much, Megan, for that. It was a great presentation. Thank you. And if you have any questions, you can give me a call. My number is in the Mount Shopper every week. Or you can go to our website, villageofnunda.org, and all the contact information is there. And if it's something I can answer, then I have Madeline's number, and I'll get in touch with her. Thank you again.
Thank you.